It all happened in the last semester before graduation, at the height of that strange limbo between still being a teenager and already carrying adult responsibilities. I lived with my adoptive father, Ethan, and his new wife, Michelle, in a house that seemed to be designed to make you feel out of place. It was immaculate, too quiet, too soulless, as if every corner hid the echo of something that had been ripped away from it. My real mother, Caitlin D., had died when I was 14 after battling aggressive cancer. Since then, the house had become this icy place where no one talked about anything that really mattered. And I kept quiet with her. In school, I managed to maintain a facade, good grades, a few friends, extracurricular activities. But inside, it was like living in survival mode. Michelle, my stepmother, was the kind of woman who smiled with her teeth, but never with her eyes. She was obsessed with her appearance and public image, and after she had her baby, Marcus, she seemed determined to erase every trace of my existence. Ethan, on the other hand, was like a stockbroker analyzing a chart. Cold, calculating, always distant. He had adopted me at Caitlin's insistence, that much was clear, and after she was gone, it was as if I were just a shadow of her past that he tolerated out of obligation. By the end of high school, Zoe Richardson had a maturity that belied her 18 years. Ever since she lost her adoptive mother, Caitlin, at 14, life in the Richardson household had become a minefield of silences, resentments, and carefully maintained appearances. Her father, Ethan, was a rigid man who walked as if he were always late for an important meeting. He had been convinced by Caitlin to accept the adoption, but after her death, he never hid his distance. Instead of comfort, Zoe was left with the burden of existing in a home that seemed to want to forget her. The arrival of Michelle, Ethan's new wife, deepened the emotional abyss even further. A vain woman, with rehearsed gestures and speeches too sweet to sound sincere, Michelle soon took on the role of Lady of the House, replacing paintings, curtains, and even meal times, as if she were rewriting the family's own history. The birth of Marcus, the baby of the new union, sealed Zoe's exclusion definitively. Now she watched the construction of a new family from the outside, while inside she became a kind of ghost figure, present only for obligations and conveniences. As the months passed, Zoe began to notice small details that seemed out of place, like jigsaw puzzle pieces that had been forced together. Jason, Ethan's younger brother, began to visit the house with an uneasy regularity, always showing up in the late afternoons, even without warning. He was outgoing, more jovial than his brother, but there was something about his behavior that was off. The way Michelle's eyes lingered on his, the way their fingers brushed briefly as they passed a cup or passed each other in the hallway. Neither of them said anything out of the ordinary, but it was the silence, the exchanged glances, and the calculated pauses in conversation that betrayed what no one dared to name. It was one morning, between the table setting and the low noise of the television in the living room, that Zoe heard the whisper that changed everything. Michelle, leaning over Marcus's crib, spoke in an almost affectionate tone, as if confessing something to the baby that she didn't even know how to say yet. "Jason is your real father, my love," she said, in a whisper of a voice that perhaps intended to remain a secret shared between mother and son. But Zoe was there, behind the half-open door, hearing each syllable as if they were gunshots to her chest. That sentence wasn't just a discovery, it was the trigger for a story that was unfolding before her eyes, without her having been invited to understand it. From that moment on, Zoe began to observe everything through a different lens. Every visit from Jason, every move Michelle made, every sentence Ethan said that demonstrated blind trust in his wife. Everything seemed shrouded in a layer of hypocrisy she couldn't name before. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had become cracked glass, ready to give way. But instead of confronting or crying, she did what few would expect from a teenager. She decided to find out the truth on her own, with the methodical coldness of someone who had already lost too much to take risks in. Vain. If the world inside her pretended to be perfect, she would be the element that broke it. With almost surgical care, Zoe devised a plan. Using a hairbrush of Jason's that she had forgotten during a visit and a cup that Ethan had used in the sink, she collected the DNA samples without arousing suspicion. From Marcus, all she needed was a swab taken after one of her visits to the baby's room, a difficult task, but not impossible for someone who was already invisible in the house. Without saying a word to anyone, she contacted a private lab that performed paternity tests in secret. She mailed everything, paid for it with the money she had been saving for years for an exchange program that now seemed ridiculously far away. And then she waited. Each day that dragged by was like carrying a suitcase of lead inside her chest. The envelope with the results arrived on a rainy afternoon, while Michelle was making themed cupcakes for Marcus's month-iversary. Zoe went straight to her room with the letter hidden under her sweatshirt, her heart pounding as if it wanted to escape from her chest. She locked the door, took a deep breath, and opened the paper. She didn't need to read it twice. Jason was, without a shadow of a doubt, the baby's biological father. There, printed in black and white, was proof of everything she suspected, and, at the same time, confirmation that her presence in that house was a nuisance, a living reminder of a past that everyone seemed to want to erase. During the following days, Zoe did not act on impulse. She studied every detail of the daily routine of the house, anticipated possible reactions, and prepared herself like someone sharpening a blade before a precise cut. She knew that Ethan had scheduled a celebratory dinner for her graduation night, an event that on the surface seemed like an attempt to get closer, but that behind the scenes hid another intention. A forgotten message on his tablet had revealed everything. He planned to announce right there, in front of the guests, that Zoe would be officially removed from the will and would no longer be considered part of the Richardson family. It would be the clean way to end an old obligation, in his own words. Zoe didn't cry when she found out. In fact, she felt a strange, almost anesthetic calm. There was something liberating about not having to pretend anymore. If before she had doubted her place in this house, now she was certain that she had never had any place. There at all, only strategic tolerance, like an investment that no longer yields returns. And if Ethan wanted to turn her into a public spectacle of exclusion, she would make the same stage her liberation. For the first time in years, Zoe felt in control of something. The pain was there, of course, but now it was accompanied by a silent flame: justice. On graduation night, the school gymnasium was decorated with metallic balloons, motivational signs, and neatly arranged tables of juice and snacks. Families smiled and took pictures. Zoe was there, wearing a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a makeshift bun, and a brown envelope clutched tightly in her hands. When Ethan took the stage with the microphone, she knew what was coming. The neutral tone, the measured words. "It is with a certain heaviness, but also with clarity, that I decide to close a cycle," were all part of the act. But before he could finish his sentence, Zoe stood up, walked to the center of the stage, and held out her hand. "My turn to speak now." The gym went silent immediately. Students stopped chewing, teachers put down their phones, and parents in the stands looked at each other strangely. Zoe looked resolute, but inside, every step echoed as if she were walking on glass. She took the microphone from Ethan without asking, not out of boldness, but out of right. With the same calmness with which a doctor reads a serious diagnosis, she announced, "Before any speeches of exclusion are made, everyone here deserves to know the truth about this exemplary family." Then she opened the envelope. She read the DNA test report aloud, slowly, explaining to everyone that Michelle's newborn son, Marcus, was not Ethan's son, but his brother Jason's. The sound of the revelation seemed to reverberate off the walls of the gym like a pent-up thunderclap. Michelle, who had been smiling discreetly in the front row, went pale in an instant. Jason, standing at the back of the room, tried to leave, discreetly, but everyone's eyes followed him like spotlights. Zoe didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't make a big deal out of it. She just laid out the facts. She said she no longer needed the approval of a family that had never been hers, and that she would rather leave as someone free than continue to be a prisoner of secrets and silence. At the end, she handed back the microphone and walked off the stage with slow steps, and the gym remained breathless. Michelle stood up abruptly and, without saying a word, left the room with the baby in her arms. Ethan remained motionless, staring at the floor as if the world had collapsed beneath his feet. The video of the scene spread like wildfire across the internet. The next day, it was on local gossip pages, Facebook groups for parents, and even in local newspapers. The captions varied, but the content was always the same. The teenager who exposed her stepmother's betrayal and exposed her own family during her graduation. Zoe didn't seek attention, but she came out swinging. Some saw her as a heroine, others said she should have resolved everything in private, but none of that affected her anymore. For the first time, she didn't need to explain herself. The truth was there, naked, raw, and indisputable, and above all it was hers. Meanwhile, Ethan was falling apart. He filed for divorce from Michelle 2 days after graduation. Jason disappeared from the city. According to rumors, he went to the countryside to start his life over, away from the spotlight. Ethan, who had always prided himself on his image as an unflappable businessman, stopped going to work, lost the sparkle in his eyes, and even avoided the supermarket. But none of this reached Zoe through him. She heard it from acquaintances, neighbors, people who loved to comment on other people's tragedies. He didn't seek out his daughter right away, and she didn't expect him to either. After all, it wasn't his closeness that she wanted when she stepped onto that stage. It was her freedom, and she had earned it. Even with all the upheaval, Zoe didn't feel immediate relief. In the days that followed, she woke up late, with a heavy head, her body sluggish, as if she were recovering from an invisible surgery. She had won an important battle, but the battlefield was still inside her. At night, she dreamed of Caitlin, her adoptive mother, with confusing scenes in which she appeared holding Marcus in her arms and smiling at Zoe. As if she knew everything. It was as if her subconscious was trying to stitch together what reality still couldn't heal. The house where she lived, although now empty and silent, was still full of the past, and each room seemed to repeat, in whispers, everything she had experienced there. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Ethan finally showed up. Zoe was in the backyard, organizing boxes with some belongings to donate. When the gate opened without warning, he was thinner, with a haggard face and disheveled hair, a stark contrast to the impeccable man she had known. In his hands, he carried an aged white envelope with her name handwritten in delicate script. "It's from your mother," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Zoe stood still. It was like a time warp. He didn't try to approach her, just held out the envelope and waited. And after a few seconds, he turned and walked away without saying another word. Zoe held the envelope for several long minutes before she was able to open it. She sat on the porch step, her hands shaking, and took a deep breath as if she were going to dive. The handwriting on the page was unmistakable. It was Caitlin's, delicate and curved, as if each letter had been carefully drawn. The letter began with a simple, "My dear Zoe," and that was enough to bring tears to her eyes. It was like hearing her mother speak again after so many years. In the letter, Caitlin said that she did know about Michelle and Jason's betrayal, that she had found out about it just before she became seriously ill, and that, although it destroyed her insides, she had decided to protect Zoe with what little strength she had left. She explained that her love for her daughter was greater than any hurt, and that her priority was to ensure that Zoe grew up with dignity, even in an unstable environment. Caitlin had left clear instructions for Ethan to care for her daughter with respect, even if Michelle's presence became permanent. But she knew that deep down he was a weak man, driven by pride and appearance. The letter was not a confession. It was an act of love, an attempt to leave Zoe with something that no one else could give, the truth without filter, without shield, without excuses. When she finished reading it, Zoe clutched the paper to her chest as if she could feel her mother's arms once more. And in that moment, something inside her regrouped. Caitlin's letter was a turning point, not just because of what it said, but because of how it was said. There was such a rare tenderness in it, such a quiet understanding, that Zoe felt as if she had been given a piece of her mother's heart on paper. It was the kind of affection no one else in the house had been able to offer. The anger that had once bubbled inside her began to transform into something else. Not immediate forgiveness, but acceptance. Zoe realized that she no longer needed to fight ghosts or seek approval from those who had never truly seen her. Caitlin saw her, even after she was dead, and that was enough. In the days that followed, she decided she could no longer live in that environment. She took some of the money she had saved for college and rented a small one-bedroom apartment in the old part of town where the buildings had visible cracks, but the windows were always open. It was modest, with worn wooden floors and walls in need of paint, but it had something she had not felt in a long time: peace. Little by little she packed her things in small boxes without much ceremony. She didn't tell Ethan, she didn't make a speech, she simply left. And in the silence of her new home, among the worn furniture and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, she began to discover who she was, without the burden of proving anything to anyone. College started a few weeks after moving in. Zoe chose psychology, almost as an instinct. She wanted to understand human pain, including her own. She sat in the front row, paid attention to everything, and even wrote down what the professors said outside of the content. She was hungry for knowledge, but even more so for meaning. She didn't want to just study theories about trauma, attachment, and identity. She wanted to understand how emotional wounds form, and most importantly, how they heal. It was during a class on emotional bonds that she had an insight. Her story, no matter how painful it was, could be useful to others. And so, she decided to look for ways to help anyone going through something similar. It didn't take long for her to find a support center for teenagers in foster care. The place didn't have many resources, but it was full of stories. There, she met girls of 12, 15, 17, who carried in their eyes the same silence she once had. Zoe didn't tell her story right away. She listened first. Over time, she told parts of it, carefully. And the girls listened as if they were listening to a mirror. There was no glamour in what she said, but there was truth. And that was enough. For the first time, Zoe felt that her past wasn't just pain or scandal. It was a tool. It was a bridge. It was a voice. And it strengthened her in a new way, silent but profound. One day, While organizing an activity with the girls at the center, Zoe was surprised by one of the social workers who handed her an envelope. It was from Ethan himself. There was no letter inside, just an old photograph. Caitlin holding Zoe as a baby, with a peaceful smile and eyes that overflowed with love. On the back of the photo, a handwritten phrase, "She was always yours, never let anyone make you doubt that." It broke her. Zoe stared at the image for minutes, as if she expected her mother to blink, speak, do something. And there, in the middle of a simple room, surrounded by young people who were also looking for new beginnings, she cried, not out of anger nor out of pain, but out of understanding. It was as if the cycle had finally come full circle. Ethan, with all his flaws, had done what he could, and maybe that would never be enough, but it also didn't need to hurt anymore. Zoe didn't try to find him again. She didn't feel hate, just distance. She understood that forgiveness didn't need a hug or a theatrical reconciliation. Sometimes it came in the form of acceptance and choice, and Zoe chose to move on, with her feet firmly in the present, her heart less heavy, and her eyes focused on the future. The story that had imprisoned her for so many years now served as a guide for others, and that in itself was redemption. Over time, Zoe began giving talks at schools, community events, and meetings with adopted youth. Her story left its mark wherever she went, not because it was tragic, but because it was real. She spoke about identity, about absence, about how love sometimes comes from unexpected places, and how oftentimes blood does not define family. In her speeches, there was always one thing in common: the need to look within before looking outside. People were moved, cried, and hugged her at the end of her presentations. But what Zoe took away most from each meeting was the certainty that no one overcomes anything alone, and that telling one's own story with courage is also a way to heal. One Saturday afternoon, while drinking coffee on the balcony of her apartment, Zoe received a message from one of the girls at the center. "Thank you for making me believe that I am not a mistake." It touched her in an unexpected way. It wasn't just about her journey anymore. It was about what she was building from there. For the first time, she realized that she no longer had to prove herself to anyone, not to her former family, not to herself. She was already whole, and that wholeness came not from a public victory, but from the silence that came afterward, from the choices she made in the dark, from the hands she reached out to, even as she was still healing. There, in that simple moment, Zoe finally understood. Her freedom hadn't begun on the graduation stage. It had begun the moment she decided to stop being silent. Years later, Zoe would pass by the old Richardson house again. It was just a coincidence on the way, but when she saw the iron gate, the impeccable garden, and the quiet porch, something inside her moved. There was no more pain there, just a distant memory of a version of herself that no longer existed. She thought of Ethan, Michelle, Jason, and even Marcus, who must now be 7 or 8 years old. For a moment, she wished that the boy had found true affection somewhere in that whole story, and then she went on her way, with calm steps and a light heart. That house, which had once represented a prison, was now just a building like any other. Her framed graduation certificate still hung on the hallway wall of her apartment, not because it represented the night of her revelation, but because it reminded her that, on that day, she had stopped living for others. Zoe no longer needed audiences or proof. From that moment on, she lived for herself, for Caitlin, for the girls at the shelter, for everything she had overcome in silence. And as she looked to the future, not with fear but with determination, she knew that this freedom, the freedom to be who she was, without asking permission, was the most valuable achievement anyone could have. The truth, no matter how painful it had been, had set her free. And in the end, That was all that mattered.